which presented his experience and observations as an artillery officer while leading men under fire during the Crimean War. The undermined and false glamour of warfare. And undermined. He soon became well known in St. Petersburg literary circles, though he found celebrity uncongenial, uncognigal, and hurried back to Yasanaya. Uncognigal. Uncongenial. Tolstoy was occupied with War and Peace throughout the 1860s. The serious writing began in 1863, just as his first son was born. His wife Sonia, short for Sofia Andreyanova, was only 18, and she bore him another 12 children. He devoted the 1870s to Anna Karenina, and despite his artistic and commercial success, he became obsessed by thoughts of his own mortality and tormented by a religious yearning that could not be reconciled with the activities of church. And he thought constantly about suicide. His spiritual crisis is minutely described in a confession, 1878 to 79. Eventually he came through it, but his life was radically changed. He now avoided society, living and working in Yasnaya, Yasnaya Polyan, wearing a peasant shirt and doing much manual work. He renounced riding, violence, stimulus of all kinds, including meat eating, and he required impeccable moral standards of all. This was his new religion, the best of Jesus without his church. His moral stance, especially his pacifism, attracted interest from all over the world, and Tolstoyan communities were formed in several countries by disciples. But he was impossible to live with. His lack of love and charity towards those closest to him, especially his wife, remains a blot on his reputation. He did continue to write, including The Death of Ivan Lynch and Resurrection, and Haji Murat, and a moving 5-act tragedy of gruesome subject matter, The Power of Darkness. But at the age of 82, Tolstoy, estranged from all his family except one daughter, Alexandra, fled with her for a monastery. He fell ill at a now famous railway junction where he died. His body was interred at the top of a small ravine in Yasna, where as a small boy he had searched for a little green stick on which he was supposedly inscribed the secret formula of guaranteeing permanent happiness and brotherly love. Life and literature. However, when newly married and fully occupied with his mid-30s, Tolstoy had looked for the rewards of family happiness, the title of a story written in 1859, and for a year he found them. Sonia devoted herself to him and to their children, ran the home and the business side of the estate, and found time to help him with his work. A woman of striking intelligence, she had a good education at home and at university, where she had obtained a teaching diploma. She had also tried writing, and a short novel which she destroyed was said by her sister to have contained the germ of the relationship between Nastasia Rostov and her mother. Now Sonia would transcribe what Tolstoy had written during the day, and once claimed to have written out much of War and Peace no fewer than 7 times. She discussed the story with her husband, decoded his difficult handwriting, and corrected minor errors of spelling and grammar. Her hand in the shaping of his work was strong and decisive. It may have been more influential than has ever been fully acknowledged. The novel grew and grew. In 1856, Tolstoy had drafted several chapters about a man who had returned from exile in Siberia. For his involvement in the abortive Decemberist uprising of 1825. Then Tolstoy pushed back in history to 1812, and finally to 1805. He would start when Napoleon, a self-appointed emperor, moved against the Austrian-Russian coalition. Tolstoy planned that events in the 1825 and 1856 would form later volumes of a trilogy, but his main interest was in writing about the joys and misfortunes of aristocratic family life. Plans and drafts were adopted, revised, abandoned, and replaced in profusion. In 1865, 38 chapters, which published in the Russian Messenger and came out in a book form the following year, the book out in book form the following year, under the title 1805. Still, at this stage, only a relatively short work was envisioned. Later, Tolstoy decided on a new title, All's Well That Ends Well. But as historical and military interests developed, this was reflected in the final title adopted on March 1867. Sonia insisted on abandoning serial publications for good financial reasons. There was more money to be made from publishing and republishing in book form than from a journal. And the novel came out in 6 volumes in 1868 and 1869. Tolstoy drew heavily on real-life sources. For military scenes, his extensive research included memoirs, and his own first-hand experience guaranteed the sureness of his grip on the details of battle. For characters, his family contributed. His maternal grandfather, Nikolai Volonsky, monster that he must have been, provided a prototype for Andrei's father, his own father for Nikolai Rostov, and his wife's sister, the impish Tanya, for Natasha. The dualism of Tolstoy's own personality is reflected in Andrei and Pierre. Intellect versus spirit, discipline versus laxity, stiff pride versus spontaneity and generosity. As a Russian novelist and critic, Dmitry Murzovsky said, the artistic work of Leo Tolstoy is at bottom nothing less than one tremendous diary kept for 15 years, one endless explicit confession. There had been much discussion of the novel in Russia as it had emerged, and not a lot of it was complimentary. But by 1870, the first edition had sold out. The author was basking in national acclaim, and we know from her diaries that his wife was well satisfied with her supportive role. Both were pleased with the money that rolled in from royalties, though Tolstoy soon came to regard such earnings as immoral. History and philosophy. The inclusion of Tolstoy's reflections on the working of history and the methods used by historians has always been controversial. But the common accusation that these musings bog down the novel, making it a struggle to get through, is quite false. At an early stage, he realized the danger of this, and swept them all out of the main story into appendix, epilogue, part 2. The few that are left are discreetly deployed. A short reflective passage is sometimes used to punctuate events. For example, to introduce a new section in a measured and thoughtful manner, see the opening of chapters of all 3 parts of Volume 3. The epilogue itself may seem too long or repetitive, but it certainly adds to the scope of the novel, and should not be ignored. Tolstoy's idea on warfare, history, and historians are still relevant to the modern world. Consider, for instance, the following quotation from Sir Winston Churchill. Never, never, never believe that any war will be as smooth and easy. The statement who yields... this is still the... Okay. The statesman who yields to the war fever must realize that once a signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but a slave for unforeseeable and uncontrollable events. Jeez, I'm not ready for accents. This is a sharp summary of the concepts developed by Tolstoy in the epilogue. One other example can be seen in the popular political view that when the British Prime Minister retired from office in 2007, he did so having secured a place in Ireland after generations of bloody conflict. And that this was perhaps the most important part of his legacy. Mr. Blair pulled the levers. Peace resulted. But do you believe it? Tolstoy tells us that this is an unsophisticated view of how history works. It is probably truer to say that Mr. Blair happened to be in the right place and thus eligible for credit at the time when all the multitudinous circumstances leading up to the final peace settlement, weariness among them, came together to end the conflict for good. It could have been the previous prime minister or the next one, or somebody else. It just happened to be Tony Blair. These are the kind of ideals Tolstoy advances in his epilogue. The general purpose is to debunk most of all. His general purpose is to debunk. Most of all, he wants to cut Napoleon down to size, not only because he was a hated enemy of Russia, but because he was also a ludicrous figure of overweening, pompous pride. At the time, Tolstoy is keen to take issue with the traditional writer's history, to distort the truth by their narrow-minded attitudes and oversimplifications. As Henry Gifford wrote, War and Peace has its pages of pamphleteering, pamphleteering, but they cannot be torn out, because the argument is continuous. One On every page lies the imprint of the same evolving experience. In the 1860s were a golden decade of Russian literature. In 1862, Ivan Turgenev published Fathers and Children, and Fyodor Dostoevsky was at his most prolific, issuing Notes from Underground in 1864, Crimes and Punishment in 1866, The Idiot in 1867-68, and starting work on Devils in 1869. A measure of the achievement of War and Peace is that it transcends even these masterpieces. Virginia Woolf made a point succinctly. There remains the greatest of all novelists. For what else can we call... There remains the greatest of all novelists. For what else can we call the author of War and Peace? Okay. Translator's note. This novel has been well served by its several translators into English. Only the very first attempt suffers from serious shortcomings, but it was a brave undertaking by Clara Bell, less than 20 years after publication. She worked from a French text created by a woman identified only as une reçue, and her version is surprisingly effective, though much of the original has been omitted, and what survives is nearer a paraphrase than a translation. The early translations by N.H. Dole and Leo Weiner were more accurate, though they still contain plenty of small slips, and their American phrasing now has an archaic ring. Constant Garnet, the admirable early Donyen of Russian literature in English translation, produced a sensitive version in 1904. She had a delicate feel for language, though there were some errors. Then in 1923 came the masters, Louise and Almir Mourad, who lived in Russia and had the advantages of being able to consult Tolstoy himself. He gave their work his personal endorsement, even claiming that better translators could not have invented. Their version of War and Peace, now fast approaching its centenary, is still read as a classic in its own right. The errors and the errors that it contains are so few as so negligible, it has to be negligible. It has been succeeded by Rosemary Ellman's equally reliable, at times derivative translation, which Penguin has used for nearly half a century, updating in 1978. And then by a sound American version by Anne Dunnington in 1968. So why do we need another translation? It is not unusual for the greatest classics to be retranslated every couple generations. Languages change, and without worshipping modernity for its own sake, publishers recognize the need to accommodate new readers by using phrasing more closely attuned to the way of speaking. Inflections will be edited out, such as Audrey spent the evening with a few gay friends. Natasha went about the house flushing. He exposed himself on the parade grounds. he ejaculated with a grimace. Oh, why don't they keep this in? This is great. We cannot read phrases like this without raising an inappropriate smile. God damn it. On the other hand, it is most important not to over-modernize. Tempting though it may be, I cannot use a popular phrasing like buzzword, oddball, or hooliganism. Secondly, a translator hopes to squeeze out 1 or 2 errors more or ambiguities that still linger. Previous translators have missed the fact that an object referred to in the famous Tolstoyan metaphor about things colliding and recolliding is not about a ball in flight, but a billiard ball on a table. And they all translate the phrase somet is the blah 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 as to look at from under the brows, when it means to look sullenly or fervently. But these reasons are hardly enough on their own to justify a new translation. There is one way in which all the existing versions fall short. From Constance Garnett onwards, they have been produced by women of a particular social and cultural background. Louise having contributed more than Almer to the Maud's version, with some resulting flatness and implausibility in dialogue, especially that between soldiers, peasants, and the lower orders. A specialist critic puts it well, speaking of Maud's version, who are the most highly regarded translators. Their work can always be counted on for negative virtues: sobriety, explicitness, and a firm hold on the argument. However, their resources are limited in range of tone. They have little sense of colloquial idiom. To take a specific example, Pierre, watching as a cannonball crashes down into the Revetsky redoubt and takes a man's leg off, hears another soldier call out in response, "Eka, Naskaland Nadia, Nasklad Naya." The English version of this is, "Ugh, you beastly thing. Oh, awkward one. Oh, ugh, you beastly thing." That was dull. "Oh, awkward one," Wiener. "Hey, awkward hussy," Garnet. "Awkward baggy," Mord. "Oh, you hussy," Edmund. "Ah, you're a blackguard," Duncan. Curiously enough, the best in terms of natural speech is Clara Bell. "Ah, you brute." The original, with the connotations of both awkwardness and femininity, is rather difficult to translate. But one thing is for certain: no soldier in the heat of battle ever said anything like most of those phrases we have been offered so far. The previous translations have also have excess in niceness and exactitude that they can sound jarring to today's reader. Natasha looks in the mirror and says, "Can this be I? Can this be I?" Lavrushka is sent off in quest of fowls. More than once we hear that Pierre fell to musing. Elsewhere, someone says, Aye, listen to what folk are prating of. Similarly, there must be a better way of saying the crushing weight of his arm fell impotent as though spellbound. Or no, that's lovely. There must be better ways of saying the crushing weight of his arm fell impotent though spellbound. Why would you want a better way of saying that? Or the resolutive moment of battle had come. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Non-existing English explanations like I, ich, or the misuse of still abound. In such old-fashioned phrasing, I have tried to make improvements. You suck, whoever you are. Oh, I'm lying. I don't know if you suck or not. Anthony Briggs. Anyway. I kind of feel that this guy just didn't like the woman translators. I think that's what his problem was. This is not to degenerate the translations that have been enjoyed by millions. No, apparently not. It is merely to indicate that this version follows a translation strategy that is slightly different to what has gone before. In the introduction of his Don Quixote, John Rutherford divides translations into Calviers and Puritans. Calaviers and Puritans. The Calaviers take some liberties. The Puritans is a stickler for exactitude. Rutherford's intention was to combine the two virtues of both and avoid their vices. A sensible, if difficult, plan. The previous translations of War and Peace have erred slightly too much on the Puritan side. Literal fidelity being set at a higher premium than the writing naturally in English. It is now time to move somewhat in the other direction. Let me give a couple of examples. If a Russian asks, "Did you study in Kiev?" another Russian would respond by saying, "In Kiev." The Puritan will use that repetition, while the Cavalier would give the normal English speaker's response, yes, I did. Similarly. But then we're not getting the real Russian. We're getting this fake Russian where they say yes instead of repeating what the other person's saying. Are you telling me that he's not going to say "that's it, come on"? If he does not say "that's it, come on," I'm going to be very upset. Similarly, when a Russian mother says to her child, "Ne, nadu," the Puritan will be tempted to render this literally as "that's not necessary," whereas the Cavalier will go for "don't." The reason for this Puritanism is not far to seek. The reason for this Puritanism is not far to seek. It lies in what Rutherford refers to as a mistaken attitude of reverence for the original artist, besides whom it is all too easy to feel like a humble artisan who can only ever aspire to produce a pale shadow of the original. A self-fulfilling prediction. Literary translators must conquer these fears. This is good advice. Without ever drifting too far away from the original, it does not seem reasonable to aim for the kind of English that would have occurred naturally in context and now sounds inappropriate. Other ways to look at this is to imagine how the average Russian reads War and Peace, and to try and recapture something similar in the translated text. Tolstoy's literary style has its faults, such as the undue repetition, grammatically inaccuracy, and some sentences of excessive length. And many of them have to be faithfully reproduced in order to avoid falsification. But by and large, he is an easy read for Russians and comprehensively easy to translate. Stylistically, angularities, shock, and surprise are infrequent. Angularities, angularities. Shock and surprise are infrequent, and the dialogue in particular is individualized, but always natural. It seems most important to ensure that any translation the same kind of smooth reading and varied but realistic sounding dialogue. That doesn't make any sense. It seems more important to ensure in any translation that the same kind of smooth reading and varied but realistic sounding dialogue. That doesn't sound like a sentence to me. In rendering colloquial speech, of course, a translator has to choose a particular regional dialect and its idioms. And I have used a British English form of speech without, I hope, making the text unnatural for a non-British reader. The first edition of the novel had long passages in French, but Tolstoy had second thoughts and removed most of these during the drastic revision in 1873. Previous translators cut these further and provided translations with footnotes, but few readers today have a sound knowledge of French, so I've decided to translate all of it. Does it change? Does this change matter? Sometimes it does, but it is possible to indicate that a speaker is using another language. It is not unusual for Tolstoy himself to say in Russian, for example, since Pierre was speaking French at the time, Since Pierre was speaking French at the time, I have used this kind of formula on a few occasions when linguistic choice or shift has real significance. For example, in the second paragraph on the opening page, it remains true that certain characters, Biblian, for example, lose some of their finesse because of this treatment. But there seems to be an overall gain in the following lead established by Tolstoy and the moods with his blessing by making the text more directly accessible. A note on the text. For most of a century, several editions of War and Peace vied for acceptance. The first book version appeared in 6 volumes, 4 in 1868 and 2 in 1869, but was riddled with errors, nearly 2,000 of them. Then in 1873, Tolstoy published his revised edition. In the 1930s, Russian scholars preparing a Jubilee edition of the complete work of Tolstoy decided to use the 5th edition in 1886, even though Tolstoy had not been involved in this publication, but they did incorporate some of the 1873 amendments. When it was discovered later that numerous changes in the 1873 edition had been introduced by N.N. Strakov, most of them without Tolstoy's approval, a team of scholars led by E. Zademschirner set set about the formidable task of collating and comparing all versions, including the manuscripts copied mainly in Sonia Tolstoy's hand, annotated editions, and corrected or half-corrected proofs, with the goal of eliminating any alterations introduced by outsiders. Their work bore fruit, and in the early 1960s, when a truly definitive text emerged, from which all subsequent editions derived, the present translation is based on a text of War and Peace by E. Z. Densher in 1960, 1965, 27-volume collection of works by Liam oh God. Whew! And now it's done. And now we can start volume 1. But we'll do that next time, because god damn that was long.